Anjali Kamat in Cairo. As we turn now to Robert Fisk of the Independent newspaper. He, too, is in Cairo. Asked him about the U.S. role in Egypt and the Middle East.
What they're calling out for are everything which ordinary Americans would agree with. Multi-party democracy, a new constitution which gives equal rights to everyone, an end to fraudulent elections, which have allowed, of course, Mubarak to carry on year after year for 3 decades into the age of 83, based on elections that gave him 97.8, 97.9% of the victory. And in fact, to long presidential periods of 6 years in office, bring it down to 4 years, and they want a maximum 2 terms for president rather than indefinite presidency, or presidency for life, which is effectively what Mubarak got. These people are therefore asking for nothing less than Americans accept in their own lives. And the great tragedy is that at this critical moment, Obama chose not to hold out his hand to the Democrats and to say, we support you and Mubarak must go. He chose to support effectively Mubarak by saying orderly transition. He wants another general. He's already got one, Omar Suleiman, the vice president, to take over the army, which receives $1.3 billion of American taxpayers' money every year, is going to be called upon to try and make this transition. Even though Mubarak himself, of course, was at the head of the Air Force, he was a general too. Omar Suleiman, the vice president, is a general, head of intelligence, very ruthless man. His people carried out a lot of tortures in the past against Islamist uprisings in Egypt. And for many of the people on the street, there was deep disappointment that at this critical moment, the President of the United States, who came here to Cairo just under 18 months ago to tell the Muslim world, he held up their hand and he said, do not clench your fist in response. And when the Democrats came onto the streets of Cairo and wanted what Obama had advertised to them, it was Obama who clenched his fist and Hillary Clinton who said that it's a stable regime. Only now, when they realize that perhaps Mubarak is going to go, mainly because the army want to get rid of him, not the protesters, another part of the tragedy, are they beginning to say, well, we've got to get rid of this old man, but not, of course, to replace him with real Democrats, but to replace him with an army-backed regime, which is effectively Mubarak Part 2.
Well, what about the U.S. relationship with the military? I was talking to someone in a government agency in Washington, and they were deeply concerned, saying, how do we counter the image that we've actually been supporting this despot for 30 years? And someone else replied, we can't, because we have been supporting him.
Yeah. And I think, in a way, you see, what happens is it becomes a sort of osmotic relationship. First of all, the Egyptians are wooed from the Soviet side under Sadat, who basically left the Soviet Union, to the American side. Then the Americans arm them, feed them, clothe them, uniform them. After which, however independent they want to be, in order to feed, they've got to go to Washington. It was interesting that when Tantawi, the commander-in-chief of the army, was coping with this crisis here, the Pentagon snapped his fingers and he flew straight away to Washington for serious consultations at the Pentagon. In other words, to get his instructions. I mean, he wouldn't say that. It'll be advice, where are things going, General, fill us out here, give us a briefing, etc. But at the end of the day, he'd be left in no doubt that if he wanted to get more Abrams tanks and extra missiles, he's got to do what America wants, which primarily now is get rid of Mubarak, but don't make it look as if it's our fault. You see, the problem with the Americans is that when you the moral values of the United States become disentangled from the national interest at critical moments like this. We all want democracy, but not if we lose Mubarak, who's Israel's man, etc., etc. And this, of course, doesn't come as a great surprise to the Arabs. Although, as I wrote in the paper, had Obama decided to say, look, I'm with the Democrats, they're doing what I talked about in Cairo 18 months ago, 17 months ago, there would have been American flags all over Cairo, all over Egypt. And indeed, it would have solved, in many Arab minds, all the wounds that the Arab and Muslim world has sustained from the United States, and particularly Britain as well, over the last 10 years.
In fact, there's the current U.S. ambassador to Egypt, right, Margaret Scobie.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is, although she doesn't seem to move around very much. One of the interesting things is that the one group of people you do not see on the streets of Cairo are American diplomats. Presumably they get their information from Egyptians who come and tell them what's going on. And there was, by the way, slightly as a tangent, a very odd episode on the 28th of January when a vehicle identified by the crowds as a U.S. armored limousine crashed through anti-Mubarak demonstrators, running many of them down, and went out the end of the street. They identified as an American embassy vehicle. And the embassy then came out unattributably as saying our diplomats don't go out in the streets in such circumstances, which is clearly true. And then they suddenly said several of our vehicles were stolen that day. They didn't tell us that on the 28th of February. They waited until 28th of January. They waited until February to tell us. Well, how did they get those vehicles stolen? Did they lend them to the Mubarak government, perhaps? Or did they know the police had taken them and therefore chose to keep silent about it? There are many things like that. I mean, another example is when the first M1A1 Abrams tanks came into the square on the Friday, I'm talking about when they were ordered to attack the crowds, I noticed that the coding on the front of the vehicle, it had Egyptian codings for the brigades and parachute units on the side in Arabic and Arabic numerals. But on the front of the vehicle there was a coding which began MFR and then a series of numbers of each vehicle. And I actually took it down, and a parachute officer started shouting at me and told two soldiers to arrest me. And I actually ran away into the crowd to get away from them, and they chased me and then stopped. And obviously, confronted by about 10,000 demonstrators, decided better of it. It seems that MFR stands for Mobile Force Reserve, and these are American-owned vehicles. These are American tactical deployment material, which is stored in Egypt, as it is also stored, of course, in Kuwait and now in Iraq, for use in emergencies in the Gulf. Now, these vehicles, these tanks, which were threatening at that point the demonstrators, appear to have been vehicles that actually belonged to the American military, not to the Egyptian military, but which were obviously used by the Egyptians in this instance. The Egyptians do make the Abrams tank and also have some of their own, but these vehicles appeared to be vehicles that effectively belong to you or the Pentagon or whatever. The question is, did the Americans know they were being taken? Did they give permission for this? None of the soldiers minded pictures being taken of their vehicles or the coding on the side in Arabic, but the moment I took down letters in the Roman letters and the Roman numeral, or rather modern numerals, they didn't like it at all. So I have a feeling these were actually reserve vehicles belonging to your country, which were being used by Mubarak's government. So there's a whole series of unanswered questions there we don't really know the answer to, and I don't suppose we'll find out yet. But like the tortures in police stations, which are now coming to light, I think that if this regime does crumble, and I think it is steadily crumbling, I mean, the whole National Democratic Party is now just a cardboard facade, especially since the burning of its headquarters. We're going to learn a lot more of what went on behind the scenes, and it won't be nice, and it won't be something that